Muchas gracias por esta puntualidad suiza, totalmente costumbre en esta facultad, así que como siempre nos quedamos muy bien con eso. Mi nombre es Sebastián Valenzuela, director de investigación de la Facultad de Comunicaciones, también profesor asociado, y en esta oportunidad tengo el placer de poder tener acá al profesor Phil Howard, a quien voy a presentar en unos segundos, y quien va a estar contando de las últimas andanzas del Panel Internacional de Entornos de Información, IPIE, que muchos de ustedes me han escuchado hablar en los últimos años en torno a eso, y que varios de ustedes son afiliados al panel. También gracias a quienes nos van a estar siguiendo por streaming. La idea es que el profesor Howard pueda presentar por media hora, 30 minutos, y de ahí vamos a tener espacio para preguntas, comentarios. Los pueden hacer en castellano o en inglés. Yo voy a estar sentado acá también para hacer de traductor, así que no dejemos que el idioma sea un impedimento para participar. Y la idea sería que, siguiendo con nuestra tradición de puntualidad, a las 3 de la tarde estemos listos. Si alguien tiene que irse antes, no hay ningún problema. Lo puede hacer, pero por lo menos sepan de que la primera media hora va a estar Phil presentando y después nosotros vamos a estar con las preguntas. El profesor Howard, y para no equivocarme, actualmente es profesor titular en Balliol College en la Universidad de Oxford, en Inglaterra, y también es presidente del Panel Internacional de Entornos de Información, IPIE, no solo presidente, sino que es el cofundador de esta iniciativa del cual él les va a hablar. Es una autoridad global en innovación, tecnología y políticas públicas. Ha publicado 10 libros y más de 130 artículos académicos, ensayos, etc. Tiene un sitio web, philhoward.org, si quieren saber más de eso. Y nada, Phil, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Así que ahora me voy a cambiar al inglés para poder presentarlo a él. So basically I said you are a great person, an excellent researcher, and we're very happy to have you here. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
It's an honor to be here, and I thank you for having me. And of course, thank you to the colleagues and friends and affiliates from the IPIE who joined us for a little bit of update. I'm looking forward to showing off some new research, and part of the goal, the narrative arc of my presentation is to get everybody depressed about the prospects for democracy and public life, and then build everybody back up so that by the end of the hour together, we have some faith restored. But to get there is going to take a little bit of a journey through some global trends and a sense of what the international cross-border implications are for a lot of the new AI machine learning systems that are being released on public life, right? What the impact of these are likely to be in the years ahead. I'll say a little bit about more about myself and the IPIE and the problem set, some of these big picture global trends. And by that, I mean, I'm going to share some stories that are really based on international cross-comparative data. I'm happy and eager to take questions about specific countries. That's how we tend to learn on the big trends. And then I'll close with a briefing about what the IPIE is and how this international panel on the information environment can help solve the big problems. Now, I know this is a community of researchers, so I'm going to say several things about the nature of the problems we face that are somewhat research-centric. It was our lab at Oxford that found the information operation targeting US voters in 2016 from Russia using open source data. And ever since then, we've moved to studying Trump, and then China, and then COVID, and then Russia and Ukraine, multiple layers of reasons to launch information operations. But over this time, I've come to think of misinformation as the existential threat that prevents action on all the other existential threats. It is very difficult to imagine any progress on climate or the world's great conflicts without shared definitions or understandings of what a problem is, who shot first, or a sense of where the tragedies lie. That kind of shared understanding and shared definition is necessary to resolving conflict. Misinformation becomes a blockage in so many areas that are critical for human development at this point. Now, for those of us who are researchers, maybe you recognize some of these complaints. These are my grievances, but maybe you have some of them too. It's getting harder and harder to do the investigative research into an information operation, right? To find one, to source it, to figure out the money, who's paying for it, and who's making it, who's spreading it further, which platforms benefit more. That investigative work is getting harder and harder, in part because the firms don't share data, right? They don't play well. There was one major effort to try and bring large amounts of data from the social media firms, Social Science One. This began as a large diplomatic effort from the sciences. Many universities, it became scoped down, every 6 months or so. Eventually only researchers in the US, only English language text, then no Facebook messages, only the URLs people were trading on the messages. And the criteria for a researcher to actually get access to data became smaller and smaller until the initiative was stopped altogether. So I think the research community has done a fair amount of diplomacy to try and work with the social media firms, but the APIs, the things that give us the data, these are closed or changing, or now you pay more. You may pay more to get access. We also find, I think, from research point of view, that regulators don't listen, or they over-regulate. They consider things that are too far without evidence. And so we end up in these difficult situations where we may go and make parliamentary submissions, or we may make a testimony to a minister, and find that the ideas that come back from regulators are not very good, or are not the ones that originated in the research. We've also found over time, and I'll say a little bit about some of the meta-analysis that we do, we've also found over time that the science of how we work on these problems needs to improve. And so this is about a bit of self-reflection. Our ability to generate new knowledge and aggregate it is being challenged by the nature of this problem. And that's something we need to overcome as a scholarly community. Ultimately, though, I think a fair amount of the problem lies with the technology firms who behave badly. Fully withdrawing researcher access, restoring it, but partially, or restoring it, but only in North America, not the rest of the world. These kinds of haphazard ways of dealing with the scientific community leave us all atomized, doing singular observations in different parts of the world. Sometimes we have a collective voice, but it's hard to know where that collective voice is delivering some punchline at this point. I want to make a few glib, funny bets for 2024. Before I zoom in, I want to do a quick expression of hands. I had a qualitative researcher for several months based in a lab in Poland with a lab that maintains fake Facebook profiles. And you don't pay for these, you rent them 10,000 at a time. And the lab maintains a bank of 40,000 fake Facebook users. The primary clients for this lab are not politicians. It's not politicians that pay the bill for this. What industry do you think would be the primary client for fake Facebook accounts these days? What would be the most eager client? Sorry? Commercial enterprises, yes, true, but which sector? Which sector of the economy would pay the most for fake Facebook user? Which one? Not other social, but your instinct is guess. Your guess is good. The best of the tools were developed by the Kardashians for lifestyle products, for highly automated accounts that sell lifestyle products. So that's the origins. But this particular lab these days, no, the primary clients, not journalists. I heard that. Is not journalists. Is pharmaceuticals. is pharmaceuticals. And so you rent 10,000 fake users to have a migraine, have trouble managing the migraine. And then you rent 10,000 more to have a new medicine for managing migraine. And they have the interaction out in public, and that's the mechanism that drives buzz. So their clients are not politicians. It's other parts of the sector that pay for innovation in political communication this way. Politicians benefit. They use the tools later, but politicians are not the start. So if I were to make two cheeky bets, as they say in English, the first bet would be that in 2024, the innovative tools, what we think, it's not the right word, innovation, but the leading edge of this technology, using large language models, using machine learning systems to push public opinion, that technique will continue to be driven by the healthcare sector globally. My second cheeky bet for 2024 is that Meta, Facebook Meta, AI, will completely take over the news content delivery system of one G7 country. And I'll back this up. My country is Canada, and Canada adopted a media bargaining code this summer. Yeah, so small portion of the revenue from the firm is supposed to go back to independent journalism in the country. To push back on this, the firm threatened to cut out all professionally produced news content from the Canadian Facebook using community. They did that. They blocked it for a little bit. And Canada's wonderful. It's my country. We have a problem. Our problem in the summer is always forest fires. Big forest fires every summer. And is dangerous and is smoke. And the communities in the north need to be moved and entirely to safety. And this summer, the government found that it could not reach those communities as effectively without the access to professionally produced news, and the news media couldn't get their alerts to the communities in the far north. So we faced this situation where the lack of professionally produced news content became a health risk for the country. Now, the news came back on, professionally produced news came on, but as part of the threat in the negotiations with the Canadian government, Facebook revealed that it had already developed a fully AI-generated Facebook news product. And the actual threat was not simply to prevent Canadian news, professionally produced news, from reaching Canadians, but that it had this alternative news product, an AI-generated news product, and that's what it would be starting to supply Canadians with for news. Fully unauditable, no way for us to know where the content comes. We might assume it was licensed in some way before it was processed by AI and delivered to users. But we know they have this capacity to take professionally produced news content and content from elsewhere, wrap it as news, call it news, and deliver it to large numbers of people. So that was a small example of a situation that almost quite happened in Canada, that they did to a major, relatively strong democracy. I would bet that sometime this year we'll see them do that, roll that out again as a official Facebook AI-generated news product. Now, this might have an impact in a particular domain. Some of us are getting interested in climate misinformation, right? Disinformation about climate science, disinformation about that changes public understanding of climate change. It produces, changing narratives about whether the costs of doing something about climate are worth it. Yeah, whether it's worth the higher taxes. Whether there's risk to your jobs. There's different ways of framing the solutions to climate change. For those of us who try to audit news products, these are large, complex systems of content production we can't see, we don't understand, we don't know who consumes. We have a hard time understanding how much people retain from junk news they consume. But we do have this feeling, I think maybe it's in our guts, that voters are less committed to climate, seeing the climate's commitments through. And it's maybe not such a gut instinct, but politicians seem less confident in committing to the climate and seeing through the climate commitments that they've made as leaders. long term, I think there are a couple of risks that we face in public life. We've been through one major global pandemic. I don't have any particular insight on the next one. I think it would be safe to assume that there will be another one at some point. Public understanding of health issues is really poor globally. And the reputation of health scientists and doctors is not as strong as it was, one of the casualties of the last pandemic. So trying to understand how global information systems deliver information about health and health crises is critically important. Now, we have been able to demonstrate profiteering. It's pretty clear that many of the websites pushing bleach as a cure for COVID, yeah? They're not so much about pushing a cure, they want to sell you a baseball hat. It's about selling a t-shirt or selling a political party. It's profiteering more than trying to pollute ideas. And then there's a whole series of elections that we have this year ahead, in which large language models, very creative generative AI systems are clearly generating junk content about events that never happened, overlaying them in interesting ways and pushing that content out to large numbers of voters. On the good side, I think there are some opportunities, right? There are a few regulators that have signaled they might act, pass some new rules. They might be tied to elections administration, elections campaigning, or they might be tied to advertising. There are some opportunities on the horizon. I think there are more and more special interest groups that will pay for these techniques on their single issue. And one of the unfortunate examples of this is smoking, yeah? So there's been medical consensus for 70 years that smoking causes cancer. It's a direct link. It's not an indirect link. It doesn't depend on your gender. It doesn't depend on your brand. Smoking causes cancer. But we see now the campaigns to reintroduce the questions. Maybe it is your gender, or have you seen this paper? Or maybe there is, depends on the brand. Have you tried this brand? These are special issue areas in which lobbyists are paying for the techniques developed by the Kardashians, used by major political parties to advance particular issues. I think another factor very important for us is to consider how our bandwidth is rising rapidly. The average bandwidth across the OECD in the average household is 10 megabytes down and 2 megabytes up. The major engineering firms across Europe and North America are planning for 10 years from now, 10 gigabytes down and 10 gigabytes up. That is a fundamentally different internet infrastructure from what we have now. Yeah, it is much more immersive. It is designed for those gaming environments that we think our kids are in now, but their kids will be in a very different virtual space. Getting the research ready and our questions ready and our public policy ready for that 10 gig down, 10 gig up connection to the average household is a real challenge. So there's more AI, there's more bandwidth on our horizon, and I think the deepest threat for those of us who care about the research endeavor is in the role of evidence in public life, because so many of the misinformation campaigns we have, they're not particularly successful in their mission, except in that they drive trust in the media down, or trust in the police or the courts or the libraries. Yeah, libraries are a target. The role of evidence in public life seems to be diminishing. That's the problem that's perhaps the furthest out. So we're only part of the way there, yeah? As it turns out, these problems, algorithmic bias, manipulation, and misinformation, are genuinely global. They're not just about one particular country or even wealthy countries in particular. They're global problems. They're globally perceived as risks, and they are things that we can find solutions for. So I'm going to walk you through 3 chunks of evidence, one about the problems, one about the risks, one about the forms of solutions. The first map is A, out of date, but B, very basic. You've seen these before. These are heat maps of where an information operation is launched from and what countries targeted. We did this one just after 2022. Mexico had just had an election. Large numbers of, what were they, Peña bots, right? Each of the parties, each of the presidential candidates had high degrees of automation, some of which coordinated from Russia. But in this particular snapshot, Mexico pops as the place where the highly automated accounts are arguing with each other, basically, is what the phenomenon was. But you can make these maps. We know where the accounts are managed from St. Petersburg, or they're managed from Bangkok, and their activity, the audiences are in other countries. But the interesting part, and this comes from data that the firms themselves have released, the interesting part is that these operations are not all in English. Most of what we think we know about them is from the study of the English campaigns, but the majority of the information operations that the firms themselves catch are in Arabic and Turkish and Spanish. Yeah. And so these are the campaigns when you write to a company and say, I think this is an account, a fake account, it's got a flag, please take it down. The company will usually investigate a little bit. If they detect a whole network, they shut down the network and they make a press release and they put that on the website to show that they're doing something. All we did here was take their own press releases and add them up over a multi-year period to say, where was it from? How many accounts? Who was affected? That's all. We took their data. They don't do those press releases anymore. They did those for a few years, and then we did this, and they stopped doing it. But it goes to show, as I said, the vast majority of the research we have is on American voters during an election time, a midterm election. It's about political issues, not a whole host of other small p political issues, and we know very little about the dynamics of what the rest of the world goes through. So it is certainly a global problem. Now, it is also, misinformation is a globally perceived risk. 2 years ago, we ran a survey with Gallup, 145,000 participants, 142 countries, very large scale. We asked a battery of technology harm questions. Are you afraid of credit card fraud? Will AI take your jobs? Are you afraid of being misled by something online? Disinformation was the single most important fear of internet users and social media users. More than half of the regular users were concerned about being misled. That was the one consistent global fear. About 3/4 of the respondents were worried about a mixture, fraud, harassment, online disinformation, and there were important regional variations. In China, Southeast Asia, nobody was worried about misinformation. The fear of being misled was not something they flagged. In Latin America, it was sexual harassment was the main fear flagged across Latin America. So interesting regional variations, but there's one common global thread. There is a globally perceived risk that as you go online, people are worried about being misled. Trust in the technology system itself is diminishing. Now, it is possible to work towards solutions, and this is part of the research mission of the IPIE, and it showcases one of the major outputs that Professor Valenzuela and others led on this summer, a large-scale meta-analysis of how to respond to misinformation. Now, I'll walk you through the methods, because in part this reveals the challenges of where we are as a scholarly community. We took a scoop of all the research papers. All the research papers published in English. Right? That's the reflective point number one. Yeah. So all the research papers published in English about misinformation, what to do about it, what it is, what the definitions are, what the natures of the problems are, came up with just under 5,000 published papers over a 10-year period. Of those, a much smaller number were empirical in the sense of dealing with evidence, presenting evidence. The rest were theory papers. There were 874 that were evidence-based. Some 624 actually contained the statistics needed to make some generalization and comparison. And as we go down, so only a smaller number were actually available in the library, a much smaller number tested solutions, a much smaller number tested solutions and reported the statistics needed to compare across papers. And the goal of meta-analysis is, to take our study of Korean housewives with the study of teenagers from Canada, with the study of, and on and on and on, to see if we can use other people's data put together in a creative way to answer one question. So the corpus of knowledge, what was known last summer when we did the work, went from being quite large and broadly theoretical down to a very small number of experiments and generalizable studies from which we could make some inferences. This is challenging for the global information environment because there are dozens of ideas about how to improve things, right? Digital literacy in high school, that might work. Improved terms of service agreements from the technology firms, that could work too. Or better advertising policy, a real name policy on social media platforms. This is another idea. Unfortunately, for all those ideas, there aren't enough, not enough of them have been tested. And of them, the one that was most consistently tested is this idea of content labeling. And so it can be very straightforward. If someone says drink bleach to cure something, a content label is simply a red flag. Yeah, don't drink bleach, or red, yellow, green. Yeah, junk, suspicious, and plausible. Any kind of content labeling, many kinds of content labeling systems can work. This is the one family of solutions that seem to be tested by researchers. Now, the trick, of course, is to take the study from Korean housewives and Canadian teenagers and so on, and make the research question comparable. So the next step for us was to generate a research question that made sense using data from other people's studies. This is what we landed on. Does content labeling have an effect on information perception? Where information perception was operationalized as accuracy, believability, credibility, trustworthiness. As a number of experts, we understand those maybe as quite different things, but they're a family of coherent variables. This was a sensible research question that let us put the studies together. And then the mathematical work becomes figuring out if the effect sizes from each of these studies contradicts each other, moves in the same direction, is broadly positive or broadly negative or neutralizing in some way. And what we found was that there was a broad positive effect, the different types of content labeling across the different studies that we had, a broad positive effect for content labeling. Content labeling is the first thing that Elon Musk stopped doing when he converted to Twitter or X. So we were able to say confidently last summer that content labeling works. Yeah. There's scientific consensus currently in the research that content labeling works. Now, remember there were a dozen different other options. They may work, but for the moment, if we want to stay close to the evidence that we have, we probably need to say we're unsure. Digital literacy might work, but we're not sure of what the full dynamics are there yet. In that sense, the hard work is ahead. There's much more to do. And even then, the effects of what kinds of content labeling or under what circumstances, that also needs more clarification. So misinformation is a global problem. It's globally perceived as a threat. You can aggregate knowledge in ways that help us address problems such as misinformation. Over time, a number of academics have had the same kinds of experiences I've had in dealing with the firms or dealing with governments. And we're coming together in this panel on the global information environment. Some of us are psychologists, some of us are political scientists. There's a healthy dose of economists and other kinds of behavioralists. At least a third of us do computer science, because so many of the problems that we have with machine learning systems are highly technical, right? It's complex computational social science kind of work. Our goal is to set some of the scientific basis for evaluating global trends in algorithmic bias, manipulation, and misinformation. And so it's very much an applied research project. We don't have large grants to give away. The thing that counts as original research for us will probably be the meta-analysis and the systematic reviews. But our aim is to improve public life. So when a government comes to us to say, we're ready to make some sound, light touch interventions, what should we do? We have one right now, content labeling. There are other problem sets we need to be able to solve, and that involves the work ahead. Last year, we released a global survey of some 300 researchers around the world who we canvassed for their opinions on what they're worried about, what they're working on, what domains of inquiry they think are most serious for their country. We're about to run this again for 2024, so we would love your input. We need as much advice on where to look for points of consensus. And then this research I was describing about how we landed on content labeling as the one safe bet for trying to improve public conversation, that's in the strategies for improving global information, the global information environment paper. I'll say a little bit more about where we are with the IPIE and our goal for the next goals for the next year or so. Then we can have a question about we can have some conversation about next steps, and I'd love to know about your experiences studying these problems. I think we've found that now there are many universities around the world with an excellent capacity to inspect and monitor and verify what the technology firms do, what the political parties do online, what different actors do online. But catching bad behavior, turning it over to the regulators that will act responsibly, or the technology firms that might redesign responsibly, that's a project that hasn't moved ahead well. So ultimately, our target through legislation and litigation and education is try to improve the role of evidence in public policy making, especially in technology policy areas. Our goals are to work on the human rights norms, right, to stay close to sustainable development goals. So we're not working on particular country elections, but the trans-border, the cross-border, the global issues that are also those existential threats. In my fantasy world, I hope that we'll deepen the trust in institutions. Remember I said that one of the deepest threats was in the diminishing role of evidence in public life. So trying to put the evidence back in to that technology policy process, put it back into the trust in the institutions that matter so much. That's one of the missions for the IPIE. We went live publicly last spring at the Nobel Summit in Washington, D.C. We set up our legal domicile in Switzerland over just before the Christmas break in November. We've got a number of funders. We've decided as an organization to not approach Silicon Valley for funding. We're not approaching government for funding at the moment. Both are strategic. Yeah, occasionally there are governments we need to be able to say something about. So we're working with private philanthropy, institutional philanthropy for the moment. We're in the stage of chartering our scientific panels. So we have a scientific panel on algorithmic audits that is working out what a global standard for an algorithmic audit could look like. Right now, the large language models, the ChatGPTs, each of the major AI applications commission bespoke audits. And this is almost a joke. Yeah, there's no such thing as a bespoke audit. They will pay for their own audit of their own systems. We can't have a world of commissioned audits, self-audits. So understanding what a global audit would look like independent of a firm is a critical next step to building some trust into AI systems. Next quarter, we launch a scientific panel on information integrity about climate. So that will look at the ways in which the technology platforms are disseminating climate misinformation and the things they could do to curb that content. In the third quarter, we launch a panel on human trafficking and sex trafficking over social media. Still one of the largest, it's still the site, social media is still the site of significant markets in sex trade and human trafficking, and of course, child pornography. So there's a whole set of issues that panel will take up. And then we're starting to do some of that foundational work on indexing to fill out what the information environment is as a concept, what metrics should go into it, how do we know if it's better or if it's getting worse. That's probably a multi-year project for us, but it's important. Just like the IPCC and the climate movement didn't have a shared sense of model until the earth scientist and the oceanographer and the biologist and the planetologist, they were able to agree to some shared terms. I think we're in the same domain, but involving more of the social sciences and the computer sciences. We need to work together to develop that common language to understand some of these deep and existential threats. In that sense, the hard work is ahead. But these are old numbers. We're almost 300 researchers from 60 countries. We could be at 1,000 next year. People understand the nature of this problem if we keep going. We have many disciplines. This is about the humanities as much as it is about the computer sciences. It's the humanities that give us the difficult questions and often the good turns of phrase that become operationalizable variables. So this is definitely a cross-disciplinary project and a long-term one. And hopefully one I can get you excited about participating in or contributing to or critiquing. Because like many of the other scientific models for working, it will only advance with the critique that we make ourselves. I'm sorry, Jeannie, your answer was correct, but Kevin shouted his incorrect answer over yours. So he gets the point. This is not the world I want to live to my children. Yeah, this is not the one I intended to build, working and studying and being excited about the internet. So this is the one I'm trying to overcome. And I hope, in a sense, I'll charm you into joining me to do that. Thank you for letting me tell some of the story.
So thank you, Phil, for the presentation. And I think we have 15 minutes for Q&A and comments. So maybe we can sit down and then... Ya. Y Yerko va a tener el micrófono con las preguntas para que los que quieran preguntar, ahí hay un par de manos levantadas, usen el micrófono, no tanto porque nosotros no nos escuchamos, pero sobre todo para la gente que va a escuchar esto por streaming, por favor, para que usen el micrófono. Muchas gracias.
Hola a todos. Gracias. I will try to speak in English. According to the Global Risk Report 2024 developed by the World Economic Forum, misinformation and disinformation generated through AI, artificial intelligence, was placed in the second position with 53% of responses recorded in the Global Risk Perception Survey. In this line, the report states that about 3 billion people are expected to go to polling stations in different countries in the next 2 years. The use of misinformation as well as the tools to spread it could undermine the legitimacy of newly elected governments. So my question is, how could misinformation and disinformation generated with AI impact the upcoming electoral processes in Latin America and the world?
Your question was how in Latin America, or what could we do about it?
How could misinformation determine the upcoming electoral process?
Determine outcomes. I think it's difficult to say how there's no mathematical model for how a post will change a voter. We don't have those mathematical models. What we have is evidence about how misinformation tends to target female politicians, prominent women journalists, feminist intellectuals, and unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence that it drives women out of public life. So that's one of the first things. The second is that it introduces surprise non-issues into the national agenda in the last week that have little bearing on the quality of life, the cost of bread, a whole host of other things. And so there's that extra layer of uncertainty that the modern politician has to deal with. Now, that doesn't mean all modern politicians are great either, but those are two of the problems that there is evidence about misinformation causing. Yeah.
Muchas gracias. Stefan?
Yeah, thank you very much for the fascinating presentation and the great initiative. I have a question about your bet on the health sector, that this is the leading one. Could you elaborate a bit more? Is it because it's more profitable there, or because it's connected also to politics? And how does the process work with the fake bots that you mentioned? So do they pretend to buy a specific medicine, or what is the process there?
Absolutely. I think it's as you say, it's a money thing. So the second for these, it was a lab in Poland and another one in Brazil. The number 2 clients were oil and natural gas related, and so it has a lot to do with, I guess, the value of winning a contract. Right? If one drug prevails over another drug, that makes a company or breaks a company. And unfortunately, we did see that in COVID too. It was pretty clear that some of the misinformation from some of the, especially about the AstraZeneca, I've been told to call it the Oxford vaccine. It's not the AstraZeneca vaccine, it's the Oxford vaccine. But anyway, this vaccine got an extra amount of misinformation about it, we think, from competitors. So it's about the tough global competition for the drug market. And yes, it's about fake users who prefer one medicine or report conditions that they don't actually have with some other medicine. Yeah. There's often one of the most common memes is that having this medicine will turn you into a monkey. And it just is a common one for a whole host of medicines will do this. That's part of the mechanism too.
Faking social proof. And
yes, exactly. Faking the proof. It's about testimonial evidence instead of anecdotal, instead of statistical or technical. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Magdalena?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and for doing this work as well. I have more of a comment than a question situation. I was wondering, you showed around 10 areas of potential solutions for the problem, and one of them is information literacy and education. However, every time that we think about how we can prevent misinformation or avoid believing the so-called fake news, we put so much pressure and responsibility on the users, on the audience, say how I can educate people to not believe this stuff, And I feel like, well, of course, we always say, having a balanced use diet or like being skeptical or whatever. But in the end, there are more powerful actors that I don't feel have been like accountable, like how do we hold accountable those larger, way more powerful individuals and actors that have a lot of more consequences, like more impact on this. And I feel like you know it, and perhaps we know it as a research community, but the regular citizen doesn't, So I'm wondering about that. And the second thing is, in terms of research, the chart that you showed about the languages, right? And the languages that we don't necessarily understand, but we don't necessarily know what's going on there. Right. I just think every time that I send a paper about Chile, every single time, I get the question, right? Like, why should we care about this country, So in general, why should we care about this tiny, forgotten country in the global south? Well, that's the answer. Why we should care, because we know so much about some countries in the global north and so little about so many tiny countries that we have this problem, that then we cannot understand the global trends that might be affecting the phenomenon, you know? So, sorry that I'm complaining so.
I'm simpatico with all of this. I think we know there is a great ecosystem of Brazilian language journals, Spanish language journals, French language journals, and we know there's an ecosystem of Chinese language journals. We don't quite know what its dynamics are, but all of our meta-analysis tools have been designed for scooping from the English language journal system maintained by the Library of Congress and the British Library. Now, one of our efforts is to make sure that the future meta-analysis we do include those other corpuses of knowledge. So I'm completely sympathetic there. I think the question on the mechanism, so I'm not sure. The goal of the IPIE, I think, is to become the world's trusted science advisor. Probably mostly our audience is regulators at the moment. It's not the global public. I mean, we want to be globally accessible and provide valuable resources, but there are only a handful of regulators or courts that actually will do something, as you say. And this is a communication science community. We know the behavioral, cognitive effects that we have, the selective bias and the elective affinity and all the things that the technology firms have purposefully designed to take advantage of our cognitive biases to increase sales. That's the mechanisms that they have built, and they don't change them unless you sue them in U.S. courts. So we don't have a litigation strategy, except that if a court were to ever need us as experts to say, do the social media firms share data? Our answer is no. If a court ever needs us to expertise to say, does the design of the system harm young women with body image who use Instagram? If we have the evidence to say yes, then that's... So I think the most direct mechanism right now is probably tort action in the United States, one, or through the European Commission. It's got a series of new acts, AI Act, and several of its existing rules are all mechanisms for us to insert evidence for. So I'm actually excited about those as the opportunities for us.
¿Quién? Marcelo y después Quique, ¿no? ¿Claudia? Yeah, there.
Hi, I'm here. Thank you for the talk. I'd like to perhaps challenge your optimism on the opportunities of regulation. Getting from early experience, you yourself described Canada's experience, and we had Australia also regulating the news feeds on Facebook, and they also had some issues there. And Brazil tried to do something, and Google just put an ad on their first page. I think you're familiar with that story. How do we deal with that? I mean, how do we deal with this public interest environment? So you put public interest developed technologies, for instance. So how do we migrate from a private interest, Elon Musk dominated, and Zuckerberg dominated environment to a public interest driven that is properly regulated by governments or transnational entities like IPIE or whatever. When we have experienced that, is it that we are at the bottom and we can only get less bad, or how do you envisage that?
I want to say we're at the bottom. I think maybe it's safer to say that I do think the opportunities are serious. So Brazil is also considering a media bargaining code, and I think that government has, with its Marco Civil, it has shown that it can do. It's done several times, free open software movements. It's done several muscular things to protect Brazilian users. In the US context, there are a number of state attorney general's offices that are a little more aggressive than others. So the New York State Attorney General's office, they will protect New Yorkers, and the California will protect Californians. But sometimes also Brussels, they do things that have an impact on all social media users, because the companies can't respond to one of them without, adjusting the entire platform. That makes me hopeful. There are also examples. There's also good examples of how they can act when they want to. This is also a problem, yeah? So sometimes we've seen the firms do very creative things for the Australians when the Australians have an election, but when the Tunisians have an election, they don't offer the same toolkits or the same resources. Or when the Ghanaians have their election, they offer nothing, or they don't even have any staff in country to help. So bringing some evenness to that is a good immediate goal, right? It's no longer a long-term goal, it's an immediate goal. And the most we can do is ramp up the pressure. I think one of the reasons we haven't been successful so far is that when parliaments meet and when regulators consider new rules, the voice of the lobbyists is always louder and more clear than the voice of the scientists. Many different the wonderful civil society groups working on these issues, they don't have the impact that's sufficient against the lobbyists. Having an independent community of scientists and civil society is, I think, the magic combination to getting some good things. And realistically, we won't get the entire list. And even public education, digital literacy in high school, that's for 20 years. The effect of that will be 20 years from now. That's not for the next 10 years. We need to stay focused on the AI and democracy that we have now and in the next 10 years. So getting a few things through, I think, is the good goal.
Any other question? We have one back in the back.
Thank you. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there goes.
And then you ask the question. Después tú preguntas.
Sorry, I have to leave. The ultimate goal, you said, is to enhance trust in institution, which is a global problem. I tried to study that in the Chilean case, which they asked me why it's important. But how do you solve the paradox? This is a more theoretic. How do you solve the paradox that trust institution, you have to distrust some of the information environment? That's it, a question.
How do you deepen your trust in an institution? Distrusting. Yeah. I think the answer is that some institutions, it's very hard to earn trust. It's a very difficult process, but so easy to lose quickly. And I think we're in a situation where major political leaders pick one, the media right now, and aim public anger at the media away from whatever problems a political leader may have created. Now, one of the new techniques just from the last 2 years is for politicians to aim public anger at the institutions of elections administration. So you say already early in the election, if I win, there's fraud, and if I lose, there's fraud. Right? So you say this in multiple ways to prepare for that eventual outcome. This is actually a domain in which I think we can help as the IPIE, is protecting the institutions by which our elections are run and protect our elections administrators. Because one of the worst things you can do to a country is diminish trust in elections officials, unless there's good cause, and sometimes there's good cause. But there are many countries that have pretty good elections rules that are followed most of the time, and the elections officials are independent. They have their own police or their own judges. They're separate. Those are certainly worth protecting. I think that would be my attempt at that answer. That's a good question. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Patty.
Espacio para una última pregunta. Allá atrás, ahora sí.
Thank you. This is like a small question. It's about the possible methods of fighting disinformation. That you said it was like content labeling. That sounds pretty good. But at the same time, I began wondering who would do this content labeling in theory, because it's not like a method like currently being used, but who is the possible candidate to do the labeling in the content?
Fabulous question. So there are several kinds of answers. One answer is it should be all machines, all AI should do all of it. And different platforms have tried that in different ways. Somebody will always complain of bias. Usually ultra-conservatives will say that this is too biased. Another way is only humans, never machines. Machines are too biased, they'll say. Only humans. And usually, again, ultra-conservatives will say this is too biased. So we're in a system now where most of the platforms do a mix of flagging for stuff that is obviously illegal, and then humans get involved with edge cases or cases where there is content that is harmful but not illegal. It takes a mixture of resources to do the content labeling well, and it is expensive, which is why the technology firms don't like to do it. Or they do it, but they outsource it. There's many large labs in Philippines now and across Africa that look at the nasty content for entire cultures so that we don't have to. But that's not always enough. So it takes layers of oversight and due diligence. But I would say it should not be up to journalists and civil society groups to do fact-checking on social media platforms, right? That's an aim. That's not the system that we should have. The firms should be managing the content for their communities.
Right, and with that, thank you very much, Phil. Un aplauso, por favor. Muchas gracias a todos y también despedir a quienes nos van a ver por streaming. Y nada, pues van a estar escuchando el IPIE, así que si necesitan información para afiliarse, les puedo, Phil, también contar un poco al respecto. Y nada, así que muchas gracias por venir y nos estaremos viendo.